Okay, we're going to begin now our second lecture, second unit in economics. And today we're mostly going to be talking about patterns and narrative, but specifically about one of the more basic tools that we use in economics, which is the laws of supply and demand. Now, supply and demand can be relatively simple. Basically, economists think that prices occur at the intersection of supply and demand. And so basically we get a graph that looks a little bit like this. So we have price here on our y-axis and quantity here on our x-axis, and you have a supply line that slopes upward and a demand line that slopes downward. This is for relatively straightforward reasons. The higher the price, the more quantity someone is going to supply. If I was going to pay you $10 for applause, you would applaud longer than, say, if I offered you only $5. So the higher the price is, the line will slope up. So it looks basically like the function y equals x, going out perhaps from the origin or somewhere on the y-axis and slanting upward. Demand basically is an inverse relationship. It goes downward because it's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. The lower the price is, the more you would want of something. For example, if I was to cut the price of pizza from, let's say, $2 to $1, you might be convinced to eat a little more pizza than you would otherwise. And so this is kind of an inverse relationship. So they're going to cross somewhere in the first quadrant, and that's where the price is going to be set, at least where the price the market is going to produce. So there's a whole range of possible prices, but where they intersect is where the price and the quantity produced by the economy and the price charged to the market will, let's say, give us a supply and demand graph just like this one. Now, for example, though, supply and demand could move for a lot of different reasons. So, for example, let's say that I have a market for Beanie Babies or a market for Cabbage Patch Dolls. And let's say, all of a sudden, for a reason, a warehouse with Cabbage Patch Dolls or Beanie Babies burns down. And the supply would go down. Now, a decrease in supply is basically a leftward shift. And so as you can see, when the leftward shift occurs, the supply line goes to your left here, the price increases. So the quantity decreases, the price increases. Now let's say, for example, all of a sudden I go into my attic and I discover a million, let's say, Beanie Babies or Cabbage Patch Dolls. The supply would increase. It would be, let's say, a rightward shift, and the price would decline because now there's a lot more Beanie Babies or Cabbage Patch Dolls than was, let's say, demanded by the market, and as a result the prices decline to clear the market. Now, the supply and demand basics, and I've covered this more or less, we're talking about the graph, is that in a market system, the intersection of the supply and demand curves are where the prices occur. Now, if you want to talk about this in terms of calculus, you could say where the marginal cost, which is the first derivative of the supply curve, equals the marginal value, the first derivative of the demand curve, is more or less where that price should be set. Because obviously it can be set in a lot of different places, but basically where the cost of producing one additional unit of any item equals the value to the last consumer wanting one, that's basically where the equilibrium should be. Now, really, quantity is a function of price, which means that price basically causes a certain quantity to be generated, and if you were typically thinking in graphs, that would mean that price would be on the x-axis, i.e. a function, and quantity would be on the y-axis, but because Alfred Marshall, an economist many years ago, transposed the y and the x-axes, economists have followed this convention ever since, particularly for aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. Now, I'm going to make this a little more complicated. Basically, if I just left you with these two little lines and the cross of the line, supply and demand is pretty straightforward, not particularly problematic. But I want to introduce you to 5 models or 5 mechanisms by which, let's say, economists think supply and demand operates. Now, these 5 models you can remember by the acronym ACCORD, standing for the first letter of each of these models. Now, most of these models are basically a metaphor describing how they think supply and demand work. Now, the first one, and this is no particular order, just in the order for their first, basically how, if you were to arrange them in the acronym ACCORD, how they would occur. But the most basic model, and the one that basically corresponds to the idea of an invisible hand and is the one that dominates within economics, is this idea of an auctioneer. And this comes from the French economist Leon Walras. And Leon Walras was a great mathematician, and he basically said, look, supply and demand are basically equations. There's a lot of sub-equations that go into, let's say, what the function of supply and the function of demand. And basically, if you set these two equations equal to each other, which would be the point of intersection between these two lines, well, that will give you the price. And so there's these simultaneous equations going on, and when you can find the value that, let's say, solves for when these two equations are equal to each other, that should basically give you, let's say, that point of intersection. And the economy is basically one big auctioneer that's taking all of our bids, i.e. all the consumers' bids on the demand and all the producers' bids on the price of supply, derives the curves, and then finds the point of intersection. The second group of models is the cobweb model. Now this is something we're going to get to the end of this lecture, and this was by the English economist Nicholas Caldor, who's famous for many other things, particularly in growth theory. Was an associate of the famous economists John Maynard Keynes and Joan Robinson and the whole Cambridge school. Now he was mostly interested in what you might call inward or outward spirals. Now if you think of the supply-demand curve as two intersecting lines, and you draw a spiral from the center of that line going outward, or a spiral from outward going inward, it would more or less look like a cobweb, hence the name. And why would he think that perhaps prices would spiral in, i.e. to the point of equilibrium where the price should be according to, let's say, the simple two intersecting lines? Or why would it spiral out, or it means it would leave from an equilibrium to a disequilibrium point? Is because there are times where, because the short run and the long run supply curves, they're not equal. For example, the long run, let's say, supply curve is determined by, let's say, the amount of resources on the earth, the technology of the humankind, and, for example, if, let's say, all we want to do is produce coffee, what is the capacity of producing coffee on the planet? Now, but any given year, there might be a short-run supply curve because there might be, let's say, a famine, a rainstorm, various other things that could depress the supply of coffee. And so, for example, the supply of coffee might decrease, and so you have a short-run, let's say, jolt, where the long run and the short run don't match up, and these are, depending on the elasticities of supply and demand, when you have these disruptions, and let's say between the short run and the long run, they wouldn't exactly equal out. The third one is by the Swedish economist who taught at UCLA, Axel Leonhoffed, and if you can say the name correctly, maybe you'll get extra credit. But he had this idea of a corridor, and this is the idea that basically the economy is like a road, and as long as you stay within the guardrails and drive within the lines, the economy drives like a car. It operates normally, supply and demand. It'll be something like we'll come to next, called a rocking horse. But basically, you'll get a normal kind of movement in the economy. But if you take, let's say, your Toyota Corolla and go off-road with it, it's not going to, let's say, it's bad things will happen. You should keep the Toyota Corolla on the road. It's not a four-wheel drive vehicle. If you go off of the road, then you can get spiraling price increases or spiraling price decreases, known as galloping inflation, or let's say deflationary trap. And when you get to these points, okay, it might not be self-correcting. As long as you stay on the pavement, right, the driver can, let's say, correct. If you get blown by the wind or bumped, you'll still stay on the road because you can move the steering wheel. But if you get into rough territory, then the ability to, let's say, correct the car and keep it on a steady path might decline. And so what Axel Leonhoffed was trying to get at was that the market is not necessarily self-correcting. If you get out outside the safe ranges, you could get, let's say, spirals that would not be self-correcting. You could get trapped at either really bad places. For example, like the Great Depression would be an example of a really bad place in terms of deflation, or you get caught in hyperinflation like Weimar Germany did, or many other Latin American countries, or currently Zimbabwe, and that would be bad too, and there's no reason why prices would re-equilibrate to a normal range. The fourth model is the rocking horse model, and this is by two older economists named Ragnar Frisch and Jan Tinbergen. And this basically posits that the economy works like a shock absorber or a thermostat. So basically everything, like the auctioneer said, is in balance, but sometimes things jolt it. For example, there might be an oil shortage in the Middle East, or there might be a technological change, right? The invention of iPods that might, let's say, create, exogenous shocks. And so this is like the system, the price system is like a rocking horse, but every once in a while it gets whacked with these shocks that come from outside the system, and the rocking horse will rock back and forth. And at any given time, it might not be in balance, but over the long term, it's basically oscillating around an equilibrium point. And if you don't hit it, eventually it will stop and will come back to rest. Now, this is kind of the idea of the economy, that things go up, must come down. And so if the rocking horse goes one way, it's going to come back the other way. The last model is what I call a disco model, and this is mostly put forward by the economist Peter Diamond, who won the Nobel Prize this year, 2010. And it was this idea that it's a search equilibrium. Now, what the economy doing is not finding the solution to, let's say, a system of equations. It is not just rocking back and forth. It's not a shock absorber. These metaphors don't work. What the economy is doing is basically matching people up. It's matching and pairing. So it's trying to match up jobs with workers. It's trying to match students with schools. It's trying to match, let's say, investment capital with good investment opportunities. And so what happens is that there's not one equilibrium. There's not one possible price. There might be multiple possible prices. Some of these are stable but suboptimal, and other ones are optimal perhaps but unstable. And very often what can happen is what you want you can't have, and what you have you don't want. And the other part that I think is very important about this is that you can't assume that the market will balance. The market has to be made. And now if you think of this in terms of dating markets, if you don't go to the dance, if you don't go and ask people out, if you don't invest in searching for Mr. or Mrs. Right, you might not find them, even though Mr. and Mrs. Right might actually be out there. And so just positing, for example, this kind of auctioneer model, for example, that will automatically find and match you with, let's say, your ideal mate, or match you on other dimensions of compatibility, you actually have to go and make an effort. And as a result, there can be, let's say, high and low equilibriums, because maybe people come to the point where they think, hey, it's not worth the effort. Or they come to the point of thinking, hey, things are good. And so people can be overly and underly optimistic. Another part of Peter Diamond's disco model is this idea of expectations. That if you expect things to get better, they probably will. And if you expect things to get worse, it'll probably get worse. And so what people expect to happen will kind of drive their willingness to go and search for these opportunities and search for their pairs. And as a result of searching, they'll actually find them. But they could also become discouraged as well, leading to a bad situation. Okay, now I gave you kind of a pretty detailed explanation, but we're going to get more into these 5 different models. But I first want to go back to some basics of supply and demand. So as I said before, demand curves slope downwards. D for demand, D for downwards. You buy more of something when prices are lower. It's an inverse relationship. Low prices, high quantity. Low quantity, high prices, low quantity. Low prices, high quantity. Now I probably said that wrong, but read what's on the screen. Now, we're not just looking at the general trend, i.e. that it goes downwards, but the shape of the demand curve could change. It could be shifted upward because people are wealthier than, let's say, other people, if the population grows, or whether there's substitutes. For example, for example, a pencil and a pen might be substitutes for each other. If all